I'm Helen Brantley, current chair of the North Carolina Psychology Board. Welcome to the Training for Supervision for licensees and applicants in North Carolina. There will be a knowledge check which you must complete and pass at the 80% level to receive credit for the training. The knowledge check will be at the conclusion of the presentation. In addition, at the end of the training, you will be asked to complete a survey regarding the efficacy of the training for you. There are 4 sections to the supervision training, and each section has its own learning objectives. Part 1 is an overview of the North Carolina Psychology Practice Act and the board rules. There are 3 learning objectives for this section. Number 1, to identify who is required to be supervised, what is required, and when supervision must occur. Second learning objective is to identify required documentation and methods of documentation. And number 3, to define problems and understand investigations. Part 2 is about forms and contracts. The 2 learning objectives for this section include: number 1, identifying specifics of the completion of contracts, and 2, defining when reports are necessary. Part 3 looks at factors which makes up high-quality supervision. The learning objectives for this section include defining different models of supervision, and 2, identifying ethical duties and challenges. Part 4 is a section on competence and self-care. The learning objectives for this section include identifying ethical principles and standards related to self-care and competence, and number 2, identifying 2 key strategies for incorporating self-care into supervision. Who are our presenters who have given so generously of their knowledge and time? Part 1 will be presented by Sandra Panico, attorney for the board, and Mark Davis, who is the staff psychologist and investigator for the board. Part 2 will be presented by Kayla Green, the board's administrative manager in charge of supervision forms and contracts. Parts 3 and 4 will be presented by Dr. Erica Wise, who has a long list of credentials, including having been chair of the board and of NCPA, and on multiple committees of APA. One of her areas of expertise is supervision, for which she has received several awards. We are particularly grateful to Dr. Wise for her dedication to this project.
Hi, I'm Sandra Panico, the attorney for the North Carolina Psychology Board, and today I will be providing you with a very general overview of the board rules that govern supervision. These are some of the things I will be discussing with you today on this slide. As you can see from this slide, the sources of the board's requirements for supervision first go from the North Carolina Psychology Practice Act. The North Carolina Psychology Practice Act requires supervision, but then the board rules govern the specifics of what that supervision looks like. So the board is authorized to create these rules through the Practice Act. And the rules govern the format, setting, frequency, qualifications of the supervisor, and the responsibilities of the supervisor. And these are some of the things I will be discussing today. Who requires supervision? All applicants for licensure require supervision. Licensed psychological associates, provisionally licensed psychologists, and psychologists under disciplinary consent order. Who can supervise? As you can see from this slide, a licensed psychologist issued a permanent licensure by the board, any person who was in a psychology position with the state of North Carolina on December 31st, 1979, who is still so employed, a doctoral level licensed psychologist who is licensed in the jurisdiction where the supervisee is practicing psychology. So this is for out-of-state practice. And an LPA who is under level 3 supervision and a health services provider. And we'll discuss the levels of supervision later in this presentation. The board can disapprove a supervisor if there is documentation that the supervisor is not competent or qualified to supervise the supervisee, documentation that the supervisor has failed to adhere to legal or ethical standards, documentation that there is a lack of similarity in training, experience, and area of practice from the supervisor to the supervisee. So basically, again, the supervisor is not competent to supervise the supervisee. If the supervisor has any disciplinary or remedial action taken by this board or another board, that's another thing that would be considered by the board in determining whether a supervisor can supervise a supervisee. And finally, documentation that the supervisor has not completed this training. So these are the things the board can consider in whether to approve or disapprove a supervisor. Each supervisor shall assess his or her ability to meet the supervisory needs of the supervisee, and any potential supervisees. Offer and provide supervision only within the supervisor's area of competence, and enter into written agreements with the supervisee on the board-adopted supervision contract form. So this all goes to whether the supervisor is competent. If they're competent, they need to make sure they stay competent, that they enter into a supervision contract with the supervisee rather, and that they direct the supervisee to practice only within the supervisee's areas of competence as qualified by training, experience, or supervised experience. The supervisor also needs to establish and maintain a level of supervisory contact consistent with that described in the supervision contract form on file with the board, and to be accessible to the supervisee. So if the supervisee needs some interaction, some feedback from the supervisor at a time when they don't have a session, to be accessible, reasonably accessible to that supervisee, and to direct the supervisee to keep the supervisor informed of services performed by the supervisee. The supervisor also shall advise the board if the supervisor has reason to believe that the supervisee is violating any ethical principles, acting in an unethical manner, violating the Psychology Practice Act. So supervisors need to take very seriously any potential unethical behavior by the supervisee, and if the supervisor discovers that the supervisee has practiced unethically or violated board rules, it must be addressed in supervision. And if it cannot be addressed effectively, or it is of a serious nature, it must be reported to the board. The board holds the supervisor responsible for providing appropriate supervision to the supervisee and complying with all board rules and requirements. Supervisors should also maintain clear boundaries with their supervisees and not enter into situations where the supervisee could be taken advantage of, given the nature of the relationship and the power that the supervisor has. Accurate documentation of the supervisory sessions, as well as the supervision report forms, can assist in resolving any issues in supervision. Frequency of supervision. So for applicants, the frequency is 1 hour per week during any week in which the applicant practices psychology. For provisional licensees, it's again, if practicing in North Carolina, provisional licensee shall receive at least 1 hour per week of face-to-face supervision during any week in which the provisional licensee is practicing psychology. Now, for LPAs, it's a little bit more complicated. First of all, supervision for LPAs shall be provided in an individual face-to-face supervision, sessions which last no longer than 2 hours and no less than 30 minutes, by an individual who is an appropriate supervisor. Now, face-to-face supervision can be either in-person face-to-face or via video, interactive, live technology, and that's within the discretion of the supervisor. The rates of supervision shall be provided for each separate work setting in which the psychological associate engages in activities requiring supervision. So for a level 1, which is a psychological associate with less than 3 calendar years, consisting of 4,500 hours of post-licensure supervised experience, minimum supervision shall be provided as follows. Okay, so the number of hours per month engaged in activities is 1 to 10 hours. So if they're engaged in activities for 1 to 10 hours that require supervision, then they are required to get 1 hour per month of supervision. If the psychological associate is engaged in activities requiring supervision for 11 to 20 hours per month, then they're required to receive 2 hours per month of supervision. If the psychological associate is engaged in activities that require supervision from 21 to 30 hours, they're required to receive 3 hours per month of supervision. If they're engaged in activities that require supervision for 31 plus hours, they are required to receive 4 hours per month of supervision. Again, this is all in the board rules in specific detail, and you can refer to the rules for these numbers. Now, level 2 supervision, if after 3 years consisting of 4,500 hours, the psychological associate does not meet the pass point on the EPPP of a scaled score of 500, then they can go to level 2 supervision. At level 2 supervision, they receive 1 hour of supervision per month, regardless of the number of hours that they're engaged in activities that require supervision. That same psychological associate who received that 3, who's at level 2, can go to level 3 after 5 years. So if they've received that, if they did not receive that scale score of 500 and they've gone to level 2, they can go to level 3 after 5 years. And at level 3, they receive a minimum 1 hour of supervision every 3 months. So there's the other situation where the psychological associate can go from level 1 to level 3 directly and skip over level 2 supervision. And that's if they received the scaled score of 500. If they meet that pass point of the scaled score of 500, they can go directly from level 1 to level 3 supervision. And again, at level 3, they receive 1 hour supervision for every 3 months of practice, regardless of the number of hours of practice. Documentation. A supervisor is required to maintain a record of supervision with the supervisee that documents the dates, appointment times, and duration of each session, fees charged for the session, and the summary of treatment or assessment issues addressed, concerns identified by the supervisor and supervisee, recommendations of the supervisor, intended outcomes or recommendations. And these documents are required to be maintained for 7 years, or if there are any pending legal or ethical investigations or proceedings, or if there are any other compelling circumstances, the supervisor shall retain the complete record of supervision securely and confidentially for a period of 7 years from the final resolution of such legal or ethical matters. So it could be indefinite. Generally, the supervisor and supervisee should not have any other personal or familiar relationships, except in extraordinary circumstances, such as lack of availability of any other qualified supervisor. In such cases, the board shall require documentation from the supervisor or supervisee that no other supervision is available, and 3 reference letters from other mental health professionals regarding the supervisor's ability to perform the supervision requirements of this rule. This is going to be an extremely rare exception, especially now that supervision can be conducted virtually, remotely, live. It's going to be a very rare situation, if ever, that this would happen. Methods of supervision, as I've already discussed. Methods of supervision. Supervision is required to be face-to-face, and that means both in-person supervision, where the supervisor and supervisee meet in person at the same physical location, and it also means electronic means of face-to-face interaction without meeting in the same room in person. The face-to-face supervision, if it's not in person in the same room, shall be live, interactive, and visual. Video or other technology may be used, so long as it is real time and involves verbal and visual interaction for the entire session. The face-to-face supervision, regardless of the medium, shall be confidential and maintain the confidentiality of communication as it relates to the identifying information regarding patients and clients. When a supervisor and a supervisee are deciding whether to meet in person or through electronic medium, they shall consider such factors as whether reports or evaluations can be reviewed and whether that can be done effectively through an electronic medium, whether the supervisee relationship is recently established, and whether there are concerns that are better addressed in person. So this is within the discretion of the supervisor to be discussed with the supervisee, whether it's better to be in person and whether it cannot be handled effectively electronically, the supervision. The board may require additional supervision when there are problems identified in prior supervision reports. So the board reviewing supervision reports and sees there's problems, and they may require it for the supervisee. Documentation is lacking, or there's problems, or problems have arisen in correspondence with the board. A supervisor may also require the supervisee to receive additional supervision when the supervisor believes it's necessary to maintain standards of practice, including legal and ethical standards, and the supervisor should well document those issues. Vignette 1. A recently licensed LPA contracts for supervision but never comes in. The supervisor leaves several voicemails that are not returned by the supervisee. The supervisor thinks, she's a responsible professional, I'll wait for her to contact me. What do you think of this course of action? And what should the supervisor have done in this case? Since the LP, the supervisor, let's call them the supervisor has entered into a supervision contract with the LPA. The supervisor is under an obligation to provide the supervision. If the supervisor cannot provide the supervision because the LPA does not respond and the supervisor can't schedule sessions with the LPA, then the supervisor needs to file a supervision report with the board documenting the termination of the supervisory relationship. Basically, he's not providing supervision, the supervision has been terminated. This will end the supervisor's responsibilities to provide supervision and will alert the board to the fact that the LPA is not receiving supervision as required. So in this situation, the supervisor can't just ignore this responsibility and say, since they're not returning my voicemails, I'll leave well enough alone. They actually have to go beyond that and file a supervision report terminating the arrangement. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mark Davis. I'm the staff psychologist investigator for the North Carolina Psychology Board. And today we're going to be talking about some supervision issues that could potentially cause an investigation by the board. But before we do that, we're going to take a look at vignette number 2. The supervisor and supervisee have been working together for 6 years and have developed an excellent relationship. The supervisee is now working at level 3 and they meet quarterly for supervision. The supervisee comes in for a supervision session and the supervisor notices a strong smell of alcohol. The supervisor asks about this and the supervisee becomes distraught. The supervisee acknowledges struggles with alcohol after a recent marital separation and promises to seek treatment. What should the supervisor do at this point? Well, there are a number of things the supervisor could do in this situation in order to address it. One thing that the supervisor may wish to do is to assess the level to which the supervisee's alcohol issue currently is or potentially may impact their capacity to practice. The supervisor may discuss the supervisee's plan to potentially cease practice while they attend treatment, and the supervisor would want to follow up to ensure that the supervisee complied with their initial promise to obtain treatment. If the supervisee does not obtain treatment for their alcohol use, or they refuse to cease practice when they need to, a report to the board may be required to ensure that the situation is properly investigated and to ensure that harm to clients does not occur. So those are a number of things that could be the responsibility of the supervisor in these cases. So again, we're going to be discussing common problems that may initiate an investigation on the part of the board. There are a number of things that supervisors should be aware of and that may result in investigation by the board. Investigations are common if there are issues with the supervision report, such as reported hours being inaccurate or other discrepancies in the report. Additionally, supervisors are often interviewed to obtain additional information if they awarded low ratings to their supervisee on the supervision report itself. It's important to have information to support your decision to award low ratings in case board action is required or an investigation is done in order to gather additional information about that particular situation. It's also important to ensure that as the supervisor, you address ethical issues with your supervisee if they practice unethically or violate board rules. If these issues cannot be addressed informally as part of a supervision process, or there is significant harm due to supervisee's actions, these must be reported to the board for investigation. And if you, as a supervisor, fail to address and or report these issues to the board as becomes necessary, this could also result in its own investigation of you as the supervisor for potentially failing to follow through with your responsibilities as a supervisor and so on. Additionally, if supervisees indicate that you as the supervisor provided unethical or inappropriate supervision of some sort, or supervision that does not comply with the board's requirements, or they feel that they were taken advantage of in some way due to the power dynamics in that relationship, this may result in an investigation. Some other problems can occur related to billing and co-signing of documentation for your supervisee services. All services by an LPA should be billed under the LPA's name. Billing these services under the supervisor's name is typically considered fraud by most insurance companies and typically by the board as well. Additionally, co-signing of LPA's documentation is not something that's required by the board. If your employer or agency requires some sort of co-signing, it should be clear that the LPA was the one who actually provided the service in question and that you're signing it as a supervisor. Co-signing when required means that the supervisor has reviewed the data and interpretation of any report for psychological evaluation or has reviewed the information contained in a case note. And some other things to consider as a supervisor. The board holds the supervisor responsible for providing appropriate supervision and for complying with all board rules and requirements of supervisors. Supervisors should maintain clear boundaries with their supervisees, avoid dual relationships, and attend to the power dynamics and any issues that may interfere with the provision of effective and ethical supervision. Supervisors are also responsible for maintaining boundaries between administrative supervision in an employment context and board mandated supervision for licensing purposes. If boundaries cannot be maintained, a dual relationship may be formed, which could negatively impact the supervisee and their ability to receive appropriate supervision. Supervisors should clearly avoid situations in which their supervisee could potentially be taken advantage of by the supervisor. And if any issues with the supervisee or supervisor in a supervisory relationship result in an investigation by the board, complete and accurate documentation of the supervision is essential in resolving issues. So always be sure to keep up to date on your supervision documentation and have everything easily accessible. So finally, we're going to look at another vignette. So vignette 3. The supervisor has begun providing quarterly supervision and has 2 sessions over the past 6 months. Near the end of the third quarter, the supervisor receives the following voicemail from the supervisee. I'm so sorry for the delay in responding to your voicemail last week about the quarter ending. I have been so busy. Listen, I know we only have 2 days left to get this done. I'm very motivated to meet. I have some really interesting case developments. Unfortunately, I need to do some traveling for some very urgent family matters. So, would you mind doing our supervision or a session by phone while I'm driving? I'm totally safe and hands free, and I'll give you my undivided attention. Just let me know a good time tomorrow while I'm on the road, and we'll get this done right in time for the board rules. Thanks. Bye. So the first question is this consistent with board supervision rules? So the answer to that is no. According to 21 NCAC 54.2005 of the board's rules, supervision must occur face to face and would not be allowed via phone. Additionally, the next question is, how should the supervisor proceed? Well, the supervisor should make plans to either meet with the supervisee in person within the time requirement, or the supervisee should make plans to find a secure place to receive face-to-face supervision via electronic means, such as by video call or video conferencing. Additionally, providing supervision with either the supervisee or the supervisor potentially being distracted with driving would be inappropriate and potentially not safe. The supervisor may also wish to have a conversation with the supervisee regarding scheduling of supervision sessions to ensure that this issue does not come up in the future. Thank you, and that ends part 1 of the supervision training.
The next section to be discussed is regarding the forms required for supervision. Before going any further in the presentation, make sure you have gone to the board's website under the Supervision tab and download the current supervision contract form and report form. Please note that both of these forms have been updated as of September 2021 and changes have been made. First, we'll discuss supervision contracts. Supervision contracts are required to be submitted within 30 days of making application, offering to practice, whenever there is a change of employment or whenever there is a change in supervisors or supervision hours. Both the supervisor and the supervisee have responsibilities in completing the contract form. A contract is required to be on file at all times and must cover the supervisee's current activities. This is a requirement regardless of the employment setting or activities in which the supervisee may or may not be engaged. For example, unemployment, retirement, practicing out of state, or working in another field. Supervisees are required to receive supervision per work setting and therefore are also required to have a separate supervision contract on file for each of those work settings. A Section 1 supervision contract is required to be submitted whenever supervision is required to be received for an applicant or for a licensee. Page 1 will be completed by the supervisee, page 2 will be completed by the supervisor, and then page 3 requires attestation by both the supervisee and the supervisor. Page 1 is to be completed by the supervisee. However, as the supervisor, you will need to make sure that the contract is completed to its entirety, making sure that the generic information and items A through D are completed on page 1. Item A will need to indicate the supervisee's status, whether they are an applicant, a licensed psychologist completing consent order supervision, licensed provisionally, or if they are an LPA and what level they are. Item B is the current work setting for the supervisee, which will need to indicate the employer, name, and address. Item C will indicate the date in which the supervision began. Please note that this cannot be future dated, and the contract must be submitted to the board office within 30 days of this date. Item D will indicate if this is a new contract, if it's replacing a current contract, if it is in addition to a current contract, or if there is a change in the supervision level. Page 2 is to be completed by the supervisor. However, this information should also be discussed and reviewed with your supervisee. The generic information at the top will be the supervisor's information. In item 1, you will indicate yes or no regarding denial or limitations of licensure. Item 2 is to indicate the supervisor's licensure status. If the supervisor is not licensed in North Carolina, they will need to submit either a copy of their current renewal certificate or a letter from their state licensing board. If the supervisor is an LPA licensed in North Carolina, then they must be receiving Level 3 supervision. Item A will need to include a description of the supervisee's professional responsibilities. And item B or C, you will only complete one or the other. Do not complete both of these areas. Item B is to be completed for applicants or provisionally licensed psychologists. And item C is to be completed for LPs that are receiving consent order supervision or for LPAs. And then item D should indicate if there has been a relationship between the supervisor or supervisee. Page 3 is to be completed by both the supervisor and supervisee. Make sure that you have both checked the appropriate box at the top of the page, indicating that you have reviewed and completed the contract to its entirety. And then you will both need to sign the bottom of the page. One of the most common mistakes when completing a supervision contract is in item C on page 1. Please make sure that you do not predate the supervision contract, and also make sure that an effective date in item C is always listed when submitting a supervision contract. Another major mistake is leaving item A on page 2 blank. You need to make sure that a description of the supervisee's responsibilities is completed. Sometimes the supervisee will fill out this area, which is fine. However, remember that as the supervisor, you are responsible for the appropriate supervision, so make sure you are discussing this information with your supervisee. Next, we will discuss supervision reports. Supervision reports are required to be submitted for an LPA or a provisional licensee to renew their license, which is every 2 years. Supervision reports are also required whenever there is a change in supervision, whether it be in the hours of supervision being provided, a change in supervisors, or the supervisee's work setting is changing. The report is the supervisor's responsibility and is required to be submitted within 2 weeks of the change in supervision. As a reminder, if supervision is being terminated, then a report is required to be submitted. A separate supervision report is required to be submitted for each work setting or supervision contract on file with the board. Please note that when completing a supervision report for an applicant, the supervisor will be required to submit the form via post mail. However, if your supervisee is licensed, they can log into the licensee portal, which is found in the upper right-hand corner of the home page on the board website. Here they will log in and initiate the supervision report. The supervisor will then log in to their licensee portal and complete the pending report. At this time, supervision reports can also be submitted via post mail or by email. When a supervision report is initiated by the supervisee, please make sure that you are reviewing all of the information they have provided. Items 1 and 2 of the form will be the supervisee's information. In item 3, you'll need to make sure that the appropriate work setting is noted and whether they are terminating practice at that work setting or not in item 4. In item 5, make sure that the dates of supervision are indicated correctly. The first date listed will be the date of the most recent supervision contract on file or the date of the last supervision report submitted for that current work setting. And the second date listed should be the date of termination or the date that supervision changed. Item 6 will indicate the supervisee's applicant or licensure status, and then the supervisor will need to make sure that the appropriate hours and frequency of supervision are noted correctly in section 1 of the report. And finally, item I is where the supervisor will provide any ratings and comments in 4 different areas and then sign the report. If supervision was not provided for the dates indicated in item 5, please indicate zeros in items D through H and do not provide any ratings. If ratings provided are below average, written comments are required to be submitted with the supervision report. Section 2 is to only be completed by a supervisee if they have a Section 2 supervision contract on file and do not require supervision. If there are any questions regarding how to complete the supervision contract form or the supervision report form, please feel free to contact board staff via email at info@nccpsychologyboard.org.